To kickstart the event, we'll start a discussion on the national monetization pipeline. To set the context for the audience, the NMP is a new scheme to establish contractual partnership between the government and private players and thereby generate sustainable funding by monetizing core brownfield assets, that is, assets that have already been created and are either underutilized or inefficient. So, our first question is to you, Subhash sir. Sir, why do you think the private sector would be interested in investing in the brownfield assets of the government and especially the loss making ones like the railway sector? Subhash sir, sorry, you're on mute.
Sir, yeah, I can. That's right. Am I audible now?
Yes, sir.
All right. So what I was saying is that the new monetization pipeline or the NMP is basically the government or government organizations' assets, especially on the infrastructure sides like roads, railways, power, etc. And these infrastructure assets are best done in the public-private partnership mode. And therefore, the government has been for quite some time. It's not a new program, so to say. 6 airports were in a way put on the monetization program some time back. Roads have been done for quite some time. Some of the railways, trains have also been given on. But what the government has now done is to bring together all these programs into one single program platform kind of thing. Your question about the private sector being interested, these are the areas where private sector has been present in some of them. For example, airports, the private sector has been doing. Transmission lines of power has also been in the private sector for some time. Roads have also been built under the BOT and other programs. So private sector is present there. And therefore, private sector would be very happy to join in this effort of monetization of these assets. Now, the private sector would only be keen to take these assets for operation only if they can run it more efficiently and make profit at the end of the day. They are not they are not government. They don't have access to the tax and the public resources to spend, and therefore they would take those assets at valuations which are good enough for them to operate the assets as well as to make some profit. And therefore, some of these assets do have a lot of value. To quote an example for you, the 6 airports which were privatized or monetized in 2019, the private sector took it virtually at about 4 to 5 times of the reserve price which the government had determined. Likewise, some of the roads have also been taken at prices. But there are some assets which are not of that high valuation, and therefore those assets would have to be taken on relatively lower market clearing prices, not on the prices or not on the investment value which the government has invested. So in short, yes, the government's intent to monetization is first class. There would be a lot of interest from not only domestic players but also foreign players, and they would take these assets at valuations where the market clears and they can make some profit after operating these assets more efficiently.
Thank you, sir, for such an insightful answer. Sir, this raises another question in my mind, and I would like to direct this question to Mohan, sir. Sir, do you think the government would be involved in any sort of price control once railways and power? We see that there's a lot of price control currently. So, do you think once the asset has been monetized, the government would still impose a restriction around the price control? And if they do, then do you think would the private players be really interested in entering those brownfield assets? And sir, just one more question to this. I mean, if they do not impose a price control, do you think the burden of price rise would shift to the consumers?
Well, at the outset, let me compliment all of you for organizing this for the students who are the future wealth of this country. And it's a proud privilege to be with Mr. Garg and Charan Singh ji. To endorse what Subhash and Garg have said, let me tell you, I've been a banker to most of these airports, and I don't think that any of the airport has gone as a non-performing asset. Rather, they have added so much value to the country that today the Delhi and Mumbai airport, they are reckoned as one of the best airports globally. Having said that, if you look at the framework of the monetization policy, framework is very clear that the revenue rights are with the acquirer, that is the private sector. It means the price will not be directed or determined by the government. And let me tell you, as rightly said by Sir, it is the efficiency, the cost efficiency, the operational efficiency, and the productivity, which will lead to the real ROI, that is return on investment for the private sector. And let us all admit, we are all from public sector. There are few inefficiencies which are there in the system, which can be leveraged and converted into an opportunity to generate good revenue and reduce the cost part of it. See, today the profits are not cost plus. Today's profits are the cost optimization. Absolutely. And driving the efficiency. I am very sure that having seen the various successes of PPP projects, this should pick up very well. And the expectation of 6 lakh crore getting monetized in next 4 years, I feel should go well. And I will say that the customer will be benefited, because the moment you bring the efficiency, the pricing will come down. Pricing will not go up. And I am very confident that the customers will get benefited. And that's what we have been witnessing in the various PPP projects. That's all from my side. Thank you.
That was truly insightful answers and clears a lot of things for us. So now that we're talking about the government reforms on infrastructure, we would like to now discuss about Gati Shakti initiative. And for that, we want to ask you, Charan sir. Sir, as we all know that poor infrastructure has been a challenge for our country, and Modi government's ambitious Gati Shakti initiative, it aims to provide a digital platform and bring multiple ministries and state governments together for integrated planning and coordinated implementation of infrastructure projects. So we want to know that how do you see this master plan of Gati Shakti? What are your thoughts on it?
Sure. Before I come to that, I want to take this question on national monetization. And I'm so excited about this whole idea of the national monetization, right? And I've been saying that even banks are your national assets. You should monetize them too. Right? When you bought them in 1969 and 1980, you should monetize them. Now, Mr. Tanfale and I have been also commercial banker. I started my career from Punjab National Bank, right, in 1983.
Yes.
Now, job security which these banks provide is good and bad. Good because I don't have to scout around here and there. Bad because even if I don't work, I'll get my salary. The fear that I will not get my salary or I can be kicked out vis-a-vis that I will choose to go out is so much that one tends to work harder. I'm not saying that in the private sector, people are more efficient than public sector. No, I'm not saying that. At least my study, which is documented at IIM Bangalore on public sector banks, in a way stresses that public sector banks are extremely efficient, as efficient or better and more efficient than private sector. If you made the private sector bank to go and open a branch in rural area, I can assure you their performance will be worse than public sector banks. If you told the private sector banks to finance the airports and the sport complexes and all those auditoriums which public sector does, and then no payments come in or these are not commercially viable, private sector would not show you the results that they get away showing now. So the heavy duty work is done by the public sector. Despite that, sometimes I feel it will be better if there is national monetization plan for public sector banks to make them private sector. The other point I want to make here is, and that's very interesting and more interesting for all of you, why would the government go for national monetization plan? Now I'll give you a simple example. There is a stadium, and all of us come from cities where there are stadiums. They are lying idle. Grass is 6 feet high in those stadiums. Even snakes refuse to go there, right? But once in 5 years, one hockey match takes place there. And I used to be in Jalandhar. And in Jalandhar, one hockey match took place. India lost very badly in 1982. After that, they sealed the stadium. They said it's an unlucky stadium, right? Now, these assets which have been created vis-a-vis the Western world. In the Western world, every evening there is an event in the stadium. Those stadiums can serve for public political rallies. Those stadiums can also serve for sports and even for school events. So every day, if there is an event in the stadium, the local body, municipal corporation, or the local city, their finances can benefit. If the private sector can incentivize the use of the local stadium for marriage functions, again, it monetizes. Now, what is the benefit for all of us? Employment creation. Instead of sitting at home and watching Kapil Sharma show or movies which are made in the Western world, if I can pull you out, the youth, and tell, okay, come here, there's a baseball game, there's a football game, there's a hockey game, there is some other event going on, there's a magic show, then those stadiums which are sitting idle, they start generating revenue as well as they start providing employment. And employment not only to the youth like you, even to the old people like me. You people forget 11 crore people are like me with white beard, above 60 years, and we don't know what to do. All TV channels make programs for you and for people younger than you. No TV channel makes a plan for Charan Singh, who's 65, right? These stadiums can provide lots of opportunity for the people. Now, will the private sector sink money in a stadium? Probably not. Private sector will say, for me to first buy the land is going to cost me 20 crore. To build a safe stadium is going to cost me another 20 crore. And I'm not sure the citizens will come out or not. So therefore, the national monetization plan has served a very important purpose. When you said brownfield, it does not sink money of the private sector. They make you hit the ground running. It creates employment opportunities for youth like you. It creates opportunities for elderly like me. My only choice is to go to the pub, but my pension finishes by 15th. I can't even go to the pub on 16th, right? It is a great, and when I go out of the house, my younger generation can go and peacefully work. So it's a great idea. Different segments of the national monetization plan, not been properly marketed, I must say, by the ministry. Otherwise, it's a great idea. Now, coming to the Gati Shakti program, the direct question which you have asked me. What is Gati Shakti? It is basically looking at the infrastructure that is there in the country. Now, if you look at the economy, if it takes 7 days for my truck to come from Bangalore to Delhi, which is hardly about 1500 kilometers, on an average in America, a truck moves 600 kilometers in a day, and the American trucker is a lazy guy. He has to have his beer, he has to have a sumptuous dinner and a lovely sleep after that because his truck has beautiful bunker beds, vis-a-vis my Indian trucker. My Indian trucker takes 3 times more time. What happens to commerce? So that is why when they started the Gati Shakti project, and they are not only various ministries are going to come around, they're going to pool their resources and heads together and make the infrastructure extremely convenient across the country to move. It's going to, waterways will be created, water sports can be generated, roads can be beautifully linked, roads and the railways can be linked. I live in Noida, right? It is in Uttar Pradesh. It is the national NCR region. Now, I'll give you a very funny example. I live in an area and I'm sitting in a place 200 meters from here is a Atta metro station. 200 meters this side is a botanical garden metro station. My house is 25 kilometers from here in Greater Noida. From Greater Noida, the metro comes, but it does not touch Atta, it does not touch botanical garden. Half a kilometer away, that metro stops. Then I have to get down, look for an auto rickshaw or a bicycle, cycle rickshaw, or walk for half a kilometer, rain, severe cold, severe summer, and then connect. Now, how much IQ is required to think that the metro could be connected to Botanical Garden or Atta Market? But no, this was done by Delhi Metro, that is done by UP Metro, right? And therefore, each one has a turf war, there's a silo. This is amazing. So therefore, when the Prime Minister said, I'm going to put all these ministries together, they have to think together, they have to plan for a seamless infrastructure. That is how commerce will expand, time will be saved, and economies of scale will be reaped, and cost will be reduced. So that is why I think this is very good.
Thank you, sir. Thanks a lot. I think that pretty much clears what NMP and Gati Shakti is. I guess the audience would have benefited a lot from your answer.
I would just like to compliment
Sure,
what Dr. Charan Singh said. Let me tell you that as a banker, this is what exactly we have been experiencing, that since there have been a lack of coordination between the different ministries, many projects got languished. There was a cost overrun, time overrun, and the kind of revenue generation which should have happened has not been happening. And I very strongly believe that this initiative of synchronization of the efforts of all the ministries, trying to see that all the hurdles are really properly streamlined, I am very confident that there will be definitely an efficiency in the logistics. I was a part of a Sagarmala discussion as a representative from the Indian Banks Association. Let me tell you, it will be a great initiative if all these things get implemented in the spirit which has been conceived. The biggest challenge in our country is the implementation part. I wish the implementation happen as it is envisaged in the policy.
Sure, sir. So we hope the same. So Mohan sir, I would now want to move on to the banking sector, and my questions are directed to you, sir. So a very important part of the economy is the banking sector. So, and we would like to understand that how does the future in this sector looks like? So we would like to understand that what can be the future challenges in this sector, and we would like you to cover both the public as well as the private sector banks. And sir, we know that with every challenge there comes an opportunity for us. So what can be the future challenges and opportunities in the banking sector for us? And as future managers, we would be really interested in knowing your views.
Thank you very much. Let me at the outset tell you that the banking, which I started in 1974, and banking today is way different. I think when I started my career as a banker, it was all nationalized banks and a few of the old generation private sector banks. But the way it has evolved over the period of time, and thanks to the crisis of 1991, I'm sure Garg sir and Charan Singh ji will agree that that was a blessing in disguise when the country had to pawn its gold to remain afloat in terms of the foreign currency. And those economic reforms, what we call LPG, liberalization, privatization, globalization, have really changed the complete face of the financial sector. And with that, let me tell you, the entire movement has started. Today, the banking infrastructure is not only the public sector bank. I think the 27 banks are already consolidated to 12, and 2 more getting privatized, as we are hearing. There are a good number of new generation private sector bank which came into being from 94 onwards. You got the NBFCs who have evolved in a very great way. You got the MFIs, you got the fintech world, and all this being there. Let me tell you the biggest challenge, as rightly identified by Mr. Charan Singh, salary to mil jayegi. I don't think that those days will be there longer for the bankers. You will have to work for productivity and profitability. It means you will have to be ready for a competition. So biggest challenge which I envisage is preparing oneself for the competition which is there in the market. See, let me tell you, the yesterday's customer was looking at the bank as a convenience, logistics, proximity, and all that. Today, nobody cares for that. Today's customers' experience from the banking industry is very different. Just about 3-4 days back, there was a conference on the hyper personalization. And it's true. I mean, you youngsters, you will not like to see, "Arey, mere paas mein ye Union Bank ka branch hai, to main wahan chale jaunga." No, you will like to see which bank is offering me seamless, technological, cost-efficient connectivity and the products and services. So, having said that, all banks will have to prepare themselves for competition. One. Secondly, you will have to look at that you can't create a product and sell it in the market. You will have to innovate the products which will meet the requirements of the present day customers. And when I talk of present day customers, you have two sets of customers in the country. You have got India, you have got Bharat. And let me tell you, the biggest challenge for the banking industry is to really be penetrating in the Bharat as much as it is required to be. No doubt, with the Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana launched in 2014, again, I had the privilege to be a part of it as a representative from the IBA. We have done a lot, but lot to be done. Because unless you are really addressing the inclusive growth, which is required, I don't think that. So the biggest challenge is this: prepare yourself for that. The next, which I feel is very important, that you maintain the health of the banking industry. And we have undergone various phases. Now again, we are coming back to a little comfortable position where capitalization is comfortable, where you have got wherewithals to grow. And if you can't protect it properly, then you will have the again problems. And the second challenge which I feel is, if you want to maintain the proper growth, proper health of the organization, bank, then you have to look at a proper creation of the assets, proper monitoring of the assets, and trying to see that the assets are performing and contributing to the growth of the banking industry. The next, which I feel and most important, as I've been saying, is the human resource development. Let me tell you that it is good. 10 years back, the average age of the banking industry was 40 to 43 plus. Today, I'm very happy it has come down to as low as 32, 33 or 35 because all those recruited during nationalization. So this young generation, they are no doubt tech savvy, but they don't have experience. And thus there is a great effort required for reskilling and upskilling of the employees to meet the expectation. The technology will deliver the product, but technology has to be used. The technical awareness has to be there amongst the user, that is the banker, and among the customers. So it is the bankers who will have to do a lot of efforts for digital literacy. I have been one person who have been always talking about financial literacy. We're done enough, and financial literacy, let me tell you, we learn by itself because everybody runs a family. But digital literacy is most important to reap the benefits of the financial literacy. And those challenges, if you are really meeting it, and these challenges automatically get you the opportunities to grow. If you are, including the Bharat into India, I think that gets a great opportunity for all. And this is what you youngsters will have to really look at. You should not look at the comfortable job opportunities in the metros. You must look at the opportunities of going to. I'm so happy today when I look at various fintechs working on the agriculture, various fintechs who are working on the various rural kind of support systems. And thus, I feel that these opportunities are there for you young guys, that you should look at, that the real growth will come from here. I mean, if you look at the inequality, the consumptions and everything, these are all words which Mr. Charan Singh as economist should tell you. But I, as a practitioner, I feel that the opportunity lies there, and those opportunities my bankers colleagues should encash as much as possible. I think this is what I like to say on the challenges and the opportunities. Yes, various other things like cyber security and all this. These are all, I think, the common for all. So we are all facing all those things.
Yeah, thank you so much for your views, sir. As future manager, we feel that it's very important for us to know the nooks and cracks of the challenges and the opportunities as well in the banking sector, and you have provided us just that. So now coming back to Subhash, sir. Sir, we all know that the United States is seeing the highest inflation rates in the last 3 decades. Quoting words of Mr. Raghuram Rajan from his recent article, that price increases in the US are spreading across goods and services, and inflation can also be seen in broad-based business inputs such as transportation, energy, and increasing labor. And if we see globally also, sir, countries like Russia, Germany, Brazil, Turkey, Argentina, all of these are also seeing high levels of inflation. Now, if we come back to India, we see that although our CPI is well within the comfort zone of RBI, but when we go deep down into the numbers, we see that food inflation has come down in the last few months, and this is what has been driving it down. However, core inflation, it continues to remain high, and with high crude oil prices, core inflation is expected to remain high. And our WPI inflation is consistently in double digits. So, sir, we want to know that how do you see this? And should we as consumers, should we be worried about this?
I think very interesting question, and you've summarized the developments very well. It's very clear that United States has seen what earlier was being described as transient, but now being accepted as a durable, permanent kind of inflation. A 6% kind of inflation there has not been seen in last 40 years or so. So it's a very high level of inflation. In fact, economists like Dr. Charan Singh would tell you that for last many decades, last 2-3 decades, especially in the West, there was a perception that the inflation is gone. It's no longer an issue. With inflation control and all kind of things, and monetary management, the inflation was just not there, and this come up. I think the question you should be asking is, why is there so much inflation in the United States now? Coming back to India, I'll give you my take on why there, but let me put the perspective on the Indian situation as well. And you have very rightly captured the sort of contradictory trends which you see in the inflation in India. Wholesale inflation, which we used to actually measure inflation by wholesale only a couple of years back, until when we started doing it by retail, right? And wholesale inflation continues to be in double digit for quite some time. Whereas the retail inflation, as you noted rightly, is within that one band of 2 to 6%, what the government has given the RBI the mandate to manage within. And even there in the retail side, food inflation is lower, and the core inflation is higher. That's what you. So the question in the Indian context is to ask is, why is inflation not there as much as it is in the United States on the retail side? And what does it mean to have a higher inflation on the wholesale side, but a lower inflation on the retail side? I think these are the questions which comes up from what you observed. Now, let me just give you my take. Inflation essentially is a phenomenon between the interplay between the demand and the supply. If the demand for any particular goods or service is higher than the supply, the chances of the price being raised are much higher, because smaller supply has to meet a larger demand, right? This is universal, whether it's United States or whether it's India or anywhere else. This law is immutable. It's applicable everywhere, right? So in United States, what has happened over last 2 years is that the government had opened up literally the floodgates of the grants from the government. Let me tell you that essentially there are three components which fire the demand or which constitute the demand. One is what people earn. So they can use their earnings for buying goods and services. So that is one component of the demand. The second component of the demand is what we call the credit. Mohanji was discussing a lot about the banking. And the banking is the premier way to sort of put credit into the system. And the credit then finances or creates the demand for investment goods as well as for the consumption goods, right? So that credit is the second major component of demand. The third major component of the demand is the government grants. If the government provides you grant, PM Kisan Yojana or any other Yojana, so grants gets to the people, then they can use that money to buy goods and services. So these are the three components of the demand, right? In the United States, also for some time after the COVID came in, the earnings got depressed. There was wage loss, job losses in the initial phase. But what the government did was that they provided enormous amount of support to those who lost jobs, as well as to others for consumption, right? The size of sort of demand infusion in the US economy is over $2.5 trillion in last 2.5 years. That is generated. If you are in the United States today, you would have been told by almost every household that the paychecks have landed at their doorsteps, and in fact, some of them don't know what to do with those paychecks because they can meet all their goods and services demand even otherwise. But that has created a lot of demand. Likewise, there has been phenomenal expansion on the credit side in the United States, fueled by the expansion of central bank or federal balance sheet. This has nearly doubled in last 2 years. So while the earnings were somewhat lower than earlier, these two big sources of demand, the government sort of handouts, as well as the credit expansion, have created enormous demand there. And since supply has not taken up, the imports into United States have expanded phenomenally. And we have also gained, by the way, because our exports have grown by exporting to the rest of the world in post-COVID time. But despite the supplies being sort of spruced up to some extent, this has not matched the demand surge, and therefore the inflation is there. I think this is very clearly explainable phenomenon in the by sort of tracking all these three routes of earnings, credit, and the grants. Now you apply the same thing in the Indian context. Then you would see why we have this particular phenomenon. Why is wholesale inflation large but not the retail inflation? India also lost a lot of jobs. In fact, in the first phase of the lockdown, over 10 crore workers lost jobs for quite some time. And even today, the workers' participation rate or the employment rate, so to say, in the Indian economy is lesser than what it was pre-COVID. Despite the recent upsurge in the economic situation. There are now numerous studies which have brought out that not only the jobs were lost, but those who remained in jobs also sort of faced wage cuts and salary cuts kind of thing. There is a small fraction of the Indian workers, basically in the governments, in the organized sector, in the startups, which have made more money, more income during this period. But bulk of our workers have actually lost. So the earnings have got sort of substantially affected adversely in Indian situation. Unfortunately, the government did not expand the grant support program in India, right? They were worried about inflation, and therefore, to ensure that the inflation doesn't go out of hand, they decided not to provide much of the support for the in the form of the grants. No wage support, nothing of that sort happened. The Reserve Bank tried that the credit should get expanded, and the government also, by that guarantee scheme and something, tried to support credit. But unfortunately, and we can discuss those reasons separately, the credit offtake in India has also been muted. So in India, all the three components of the earnings, credit, as well as the government support for grant, has been much less than elsewhere in the world. That's why the demand effectiveness in the country is much smaller and the retail inflation is lower. Let me just spend a minute on the last part of it. Why is wholesale higher inflation than the retail? Wholesale inflation or wholesale prices depict about the supply situation in the economy. So supplies got affected, and suppliers, and there has been a very large commodity super cycle in the global economy, thanks to the shortages which has been which have come about and the demand which has come from the other countries. So you have supply shortages affecting the wholesale prices. So they have raised their prices. All the wholesale goods, cement, steel, whatever commodities you want to take it, their prices are higher. Those companies have gained profit. So you see the corporate profits being very large in the country, and the government tax is also going up. But the share of wages has gone less, and therefore on supply side, wholesale inflation is higher, but the retail inflation is low. So I think it's very clearly explainable kind of phenomenon what we are witnessing in the United States and India.
Thank you so much, sir.
I'd like to supplement what you said, because I'm calling from USA. I'm joining this from USA. I'm with my daughter. And just last week, there was an event called Thanksgiving and Black Friday.
Yes.
And the kind of a rush which you can see on the stores for buying. And it's all thanks to those subsidies which you are getting into the accounts without asking for.
Absolutely.
I mean, this is a reality. You have touched it. And I think, I don't know whether it is possible in our country. It's a challenge, but what you said is, I have witnessed it, sir.
They have hugely overdone it. We have underdone it. I think we also need to be balanced. Of course, we also need to have a balance.
You're right, sir. It was a crazy scene to be, witnessed for Black Friday buying.
Yeah, thank you so much, sir. Thank you, Mohan, sir, for pitching in. And sir, we would now want to probably move on to the RBI policy rate, since we are talking about inflation. And like whenever we talk about inflation, one thing that comes into the mind is the RBI policy rates. So, Charan sir, for this, I would like to come to you. So, our economy is showing signs of improvement, and we are probably moving towards pre-pandemic levels of economic activity. The Q2 GDP figures were released a few days back, and the growth that we saw was around 8.5%. So we probably are seeing a K-shaped recovery. Some sectors are going up, some sectors are yet to recover. So, and we just talked about that core inflation and WPI inflation are showing signs of concern. And the next monetary policy starts on 6th of December and will end on 8th of December. So, sir, when do you think will the RBI start normalizing their policy and slowly start increasing the interest rates? Charan sir, you are on mute, sorry.
It's a good question, but let me just take one more. I want to supplement what Mr. Mohan Tansale said about the challenges in banking. You know, the more I think about banking, and I wonder what the challenges are. He's been a practical banker and solid. So his analysis is, of course, rock solid. But I'll ask you one question, and this question was asked to me by a Japanese professor. He was about 20 years older than me and hardly could walk. And then he asked me this question. Now, when you speak about banking as important, you know, the easiest way to explain banking these days is like banking is oxygen. But to synthesize oxygen and take the benefit of it, you need solid lungs. You saw this in COVID. If your lungs are not solid, how much oxygen you supply, nothing will happen, right? Banks are sitting with funds. Banks also have laid down the rules on which they are ready to operate. But if the lungs are not ready to absorb oxygen, what can you do? So that is the challenge that has happened now. To me, the industry, and they're just in a country with 133 crore people, 16% of the world population, how many companies can you lend? And how many can you lend with confidence and say that my things will not go bad? The best of the best suddenly turn up and say, and come to the bankruptcy court and say, declare me bankrupt. The company is bankrupt, but the owner still owns a fleet of aircrafts. What do you do in such a situation? So to me, the biggest challenge to Indian banking is individuals. How do I make sure that this cake is shared with everyone? I get a piece of the cake and I make sure that others can't eat it after that. Is that fair? And in that, sorry, young students, you and me all are party to it. So I think we Indians have to be prepared that the banking system, which has been nurtured and nursed, and I can tell you, Mr. Mohan Tansale is a career banker, spent nearly 35 years in banking. I am not a career banker, but in a way, I've also spent all my life in banking, either in the Reserve Bank or in the International Monetary Fund, or as a commercial banker as my beginning of my career. Bankers are not bad. It is the people to whom we lend, they let us down. So that is why I say the biggest, and you cannot have an island of honesty in amidst an ocean of dishonesty. Everybody is dishonest, but the banker should be honest. So what is a banker? Is he an angel? Should he be an angel? So I think you and me and the whole country has to understand that the challenge to banking are individuals, right? The second thing, look, the Prime Minister wants a $5 trillion economy. Even if the Prime Minister doesn't want, do not we Indians want to be the best in the world? The best in the world is America, $20 trillion economy. Sometimes I feel the Prime Minister is applying a brake on me. I want to be a $20 trillion economy. He says a $5 trillion economy, right? But I now ask a question. How many of us, individuals and bankers and policymakers and professors, how many of us are ready for a $20 trillion economy? Or even for that matter, $5 trillion economy? How many of us think I'm now a $5 trillion economy? You know what a $5 trillion economy means? America is 20, China is 12, I'll be number 3. Am I ready for number 3? Do my conduct show that? Do my education and my fervor to achieve the best show that? No. You just discuss with your father and mother and ask, Dad, are you ready for a $5 trillion economy? He'll stare at you. Beta, I'm just looking for my monthly check. What are you talking? Each one of us, right? So I think the challenge to banking is firstly, all of us. Secondly, our thought process. We have limited our thought process. Now I come again to the question that you have asked. And the question basically is about when will the RBI move its interest rate cycle? It's very, very difficult to say that. I'll tell you the reason. As Mr. Garg has just explained so well about inflation, and he has also analyzed the inflationary trends in Western world. So that also tells you, and Madam Priyanshi, the way you mentioned, there are different countries with different levels of inflation. UK and US is much higher. Germany is not that much. Russia and Brazil are much higher. Turkey is still higher than that. India is still not that much, right? So what does it
Right.
mean? Different countries have different inflation rates. Different inflation rates would demand different policy initiatives. Somebody has to douse the fire, somebody has to keep the flames on, right? Now, when you have different monetary policies being applied in a globally integrated world, we are super integrated now. You have seen the data on exports and imports. Our exports are nearly 23%, imports 20% of GDP. 40 odd percent of GDP is related to the world. When you're related so intricately with the world, there are spillovers. And in these spillovers, if different countries are following different monetary policy, it'll impact on you. You can't sit like and say, let America do, we have not decoupled, let America do whatever they want to do. We will not be impacted, we will be impacted. So, therefore, the challenge then becomes, can I operate in isolation? And I'm not I'm not number one economy in the world. I'm also playing in the play field as one of the others. So, therefore, if America starts it reversal of the policy and doing away and tapering, then we are going to get impacted. What should be our reaction? Because of Omicron, if America delays, then what should be our reaction? On the other hand, UK and Euro doesn't have very high inflation at this point. Of course, Japan is going very bad. So as I'm saying, different countries have different patterns. China is very low inflation. Each one will have a different monetary policy. So my own reading is it's not going to be a cakewalk for the Reserve Bank to suddenly say that, okay, I'm going to change mine. Secondly, what has happened is, as Mr. Mohan was referring to, there are lots of income inequalities which have happened because of COVID. Mr. Garg also mentioned it. How many people lost their job? If you see recently, CLSA did a quick survey, and this is a very sad figure which I'm going to share with you. A small sample of 1,000 people, 750 said they have either had loss of job or reduction in their income, substantiating what the former finance secretary just said, right? He's so much onto it. If that is true, if income inequalities are widening, then your monetary policy will have to be very, very accommodative. It cannot stress itself. Other thing, all these years, and now I'm beginning to realize it, all these years, the Prime Minister and the policymaker, everybody said financial inclusion meant Jan Dhan account. We opened 43 crore Jan Dhan accounts. But what about the MSMEs? There are about 7 to 9 crore MSMEs. We do not even have the exact figure today. But whatever little figure that we have, only 10% of them are registered. And many of them do not have bank accounts properly. So therefore, if income inequalities are widening and we want the formal sector to become strong because they can get subsidized or in money at the low rates of interest, then the Reserve Bank's monetary policy further has to be very cautious. Over and above it, now what has happened? People have started talking about the climate change. And because of COVID, there are income inequalities which will reflect on the balance sheet of commercial banks. The Reserve Bank normally does a stress test of its assets, but has anybody thought of green stress test? Because Prime Minister had made a promise now, and we have to take care of that promise. Has anybody spoken about the transition that will take place? And has anybody spoken about the green stress test or climate stress test? No. So, therefore, long story short, to my mind, at least in the next 2 to 3, at least not before April, I see a reversal in the interest rates. And I wish it doesn't happen. We will have to clearly watch how Omicron plays out, what America's inflationary, and as Mr. Garg was mentioning, inflation may be persisting. If it was transitory just because of semiconductors or because of delays in the ports or because of some problem in Vietnam, that is transitory. But if it's persisting, the reaction of the monetary policy in the rest of the world will be different. RBI will have to be cautious. Let me then conclude this by saying I don't see a reversal in the interest rate cycle, at least till April.
Thank you so much, sir. The way that you explain things really made us think a lot and also clears out a lot of things for us. And because you explained it in such a simple manner, we really appreciate it. So since now we've discussed about the government, and Charan sir has almost also touched a little on the credit growth as well. So Mohan sir, we want to know your thoughts on this. So despite very low interest rates and the excess liquidity in the market, credit growth is still not picking up. So what do you think are the challenges here and how can they be resolved?
I'm tempted to take up from what Charan Singh ji made a reference. We often say that, as he said, banking is an oxygen. We say banking is a lifeline of the economy because it has got a multiplier effect. Adds to the employment, it adds to the economic growth and all that. And thus, it's very, very important that the whole environment should be as healthy as the banking. And to this, I would like to relate to the 2008 situation. All of us and you youngsters should know there was a global meltdown in 2008 when a lot of banks in USA, UK, very European countries, they got into problem. It was all, and that was the time, let me tell you that we bankers, we are on the top of the world, where my NPAs were less than 2%. I was flush with liquidity, and thus oxygen was enough, but the lungs were not good to absorb it. But the lungs were created by Government of India by pushing on the growth of infrastructure. And yes, the country is still deficient of the infrastructure, and that was the right move. And I think all of us put a lot of oxygen into those lungs of infrastructure projects and resulting into, let me tell you, the credit growth in 2010, 2011 used to be of the order of 20% plus. Given that situation, I would also like to tell you one thing, that till 2004, the credit deposit ratio of the bank industry was 50%, and the bankers are called laggards. There is a quote, bankers are laggards because they put their money into the bonds. But today, you should all appreciate the banking industry has grown to a very big size. Your deposits are 160 trillion crores. Your advance is 110 trillion crores. But you've got other competitors, which I discussed in the past. Today, the mutual fund industry is 38 trillion. Today, the insurance industry is 45 trillion. Where would this money go? And thus, let me tell you that lending has not remained only the domain for the bankers. It is coming from the various sources, and that is precisely, in fact, impacting the credit growth, particularly on the corporate side, where the corporate world is choosing to go for the alternatives of bond markets, mutual fund investments, and all that. And thus, there is hardly any growth on the corporate side. But there is a brighter side to it. I will refer to the latest survey of the Credit Suisse, that is of 25th November. And I'm very happy that this survey suggests that the credit growth is again going to touch 10% plus. It will get into the double digit. And let me tell you that luckily for retail and MSME, the growth is around 15 to 20%. But if we are
Sorry, sir. Please continue. Sorry.
okay, I was not sure whether I am required to talk
No,
more
no.
of banking or not.
No, sir. Please continue.
So having said that, if the retail MSMEs are really doing well, but as rightly said by Charan Singh ji, the MSME is a big sector. Incidentally, I was a part of that committee, KV Kamath committee, where we brought Udyog Aadhar to really recognize that what is the total size of the MSME in this country and what kind of support is required. So having said that, let me tell you that today bankers have learned the lesson that what kind of lungs they should put the oxygen in. And today you got complete databases, you got learnings of the past. And if today's banker do not take a call for lending, recently Prime Minister invoked this in one of the conference to the bankers, please come forward, I'll back you for all right decisions. And I wish that it happens in the country and the bankers do take a call. Let me tell you, today's bankers are very lucky that they got so much databases, analytics, information available to do a very informed credit decision. You can do a good due diligence on the borrowers, good due diligence on the enterprise. But more important than the due diligence for onboarding, most important part for you guys, I'd like to tell you, where we have failed as a banker is remaining associated with the credit life cycle of the borrower, that is credit monitoring. That has been a weaker area for all of us. And let me tell you here, the corporate world has outsmarted the bankers I should not get into much details about it, but then there have been layering of transactions. There have been, various ways and means to really create a fake capital out of the borrowings and over leveraging where the twin balance sheet issue was being discussed. I don't know get into that. But today I'm very happy that bankers are well equipped to take the informed decision, and credit lending is a dharma of a banker. If I don't do a credit, what do I do? And if I'm in a position to take an informed decision, bankers should take informed decision. The programs like monetization, pipeline programs like Gati Shakti, thrust on infrastructure growth. Well, 2009-10, we did not be suffered, but that does not mean that the infrastructure lending per se is bad. No, it's not bad. The only thing what you need to understand is that who are the promoters. And let me tell you that Charan Singh and Garg Sahab will agree with me. Globally, it is said that the bad assets are created in good times, where you leave your caution to the wind. But today, you have got everything to take proper caution. You can do proper diagnosis of everything. And what is important for me as a banker today, that you are equipped to do that. We were not equipped to do that in our times. But today's bankers are equipped to do that. Do a good due diligence, go do credit monitoring and support the credit growth. And I would wish the credit growth, which I'm very confident will touch double digit by March 22 and 22 onwards. Hopefully, pandemic does not give me more shocks now. The credit growth should remain around 15% or so on an average basis. Let me tell you, Charan Singh ji will probably can elaborate on that. There is a direct link to the GDP growth and the credit growth. And let me tell you that globally, the credit growth is measured related to GDP and not the credit deposit ratio. We have moved on credit deposit ratio from 50% to 80%, come back to 70% today. But unfortunately, the credit to GDP ratio is just 56%. All developing countries and developed countries have got the credit to GDP ratio more than 100%. It means the banking industry and the financial sector has potential to grow 2 times, and 5 trillion is not difficult. But then those kind of initiatives which government is taking through policy, opportunities are getting created. Hopefully the corporate lungs will be as ethical and clean as said by Charan Singh ji. I think if there is enough cleanliness in the lungs to absorb the oxygen and grow, credit growth is not at all a challenge. And I'm confident the industry will go back. We have seen the best of the time when the credit growth used to be between 15 to 20% year-on-year basis. NPAs, which were in 12% in 2002, have been brought down to below 2% in 2009-10. So there is every possibility to correct the whole situation in the given environment. I am very bullish about it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, sir. I think that your answer helps us understand this complex topic a little better. I am mindful of the time. We have only 20 minutes left, but I want to touch on the current hot topic that we have of cryptocurrency. So Subhash, sir, I would like to quickly come to you, and if you could keep it short, sir. So there have been, sir, concerns raised around the world that, and especially by the authorities and the regulators, that use of cryptocurrencies can cause financial instability in the economy and in the entire financial structure. How much do you think this is true? And I'm cognizant of the fact that the cryptocurrency regulation bill can be tabled any day in the parliament now.
See, I've written a lot. I think you can access those things.
Right, sir. Yeah.
Keep it short in the interest of the time. The phenomenon of cryptocurrency, we should see it from the perspective of currency, the perspective of credit, and the perspective of businesses, right? We have been unfortunately focused too much on the currency aspect of it, and therefore we have got most of our policies wrong about it. We, in this panel discussion today, have been discussing about credit quite a lot. The crypto world today is sort of coming up as a major challenger to the credit system. This decentralized financing, DeFi as they call it now, is a very big challenge to the entire banking system. And there you can compare the cost, the efficiencies, etc., just drawing attention to three major factors. One, the traditional banking system uses the human power to do all this kind of, and the cost typically is about 2.5% to 3% of the credit lent. That's the kind of cost which, whereas the decentralized financing, everything is automated. I'm not supporting that. That's a right thing to do for the employment and other things, but they work on a completely automated algorithmic basis. They also use the smart contract technology or the system for sort of resolving disputes, executing the contracts, etc. And therefore, the cost of delivering credit is very small relatively, despite some consumption of power which takes place in that industry. So if the decentralized finance were to expand and peer-to-peer, it disintermediates the banking system, and it allows everyone who has a deposit or who has a spare money to come onto the platform, and anyone, small or big, who needs money for or who needs credit to take credit. And the whole system operates can operate in such cost-efficient and process-efficient manner that if this grows, there is a real danger that and we also have another cousin of it, the fintech industry, which is giving traditional banking industry run for its money, literally, so to say. So the expanding fintech and the expanding decentralized finance on the crypto side are likely to sort of disrupt the banking. We already have the digital banks and new banks coming up on the traditional banking side. So there is a lot of challenges you were discussing earlier for the traditional banking to look at. I don't think we will probably be able to frame the debate in the traditional sense about good and bad bankers, etc., borrowers. So I think that's one aspect we should look for it. About your question about the bill coming or not coming, I had the occasion to chair that committee, which had recommended the bill in 2019. The government has said second time. Last year also it said before the budget session that we'll bring a new bill. This time also they have said we'll bring a new bill. they're still focused excessively on the currency aspect of it, not of the wider implications of this entire phenomenon. 1 week has gone, 3 weeks are left. It's a very complex subject. Let's see whether the government would be able to bring up the law. And only when the law comes, one would be able to say whether this meets the need of the modern generation, the need of the modern economy or not. I think we'll have to wait.
Rightly said, sir. We are all very waiting on this, waiting for what's going to happen, and we're all very excited also. And I'm sure that the entire discussion has been very fruitful for our students, especially because these are all the concepts that we have studied till now. So I'm pretty sure that we've all gained a lot from this discussion. Now we would like to move on to the last segment of our event, the Q&A segment. For this, we would like to hand over to Subbu, who has picked up some questions among the several questions that we have received on the chat. Subbu, please.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, sir, of course.
Suppose the bill comes banning crypto. Will you stop buying crypto?
Sir, if something is illegal, then we should not.
It's still illegal in our country, not
Rightly
Yes,
put.
allowed.
sir. Yes, sir. So that's the tricky part. I mean, sir,
They'll
even if the
figure
law
out the
comes
way to
with,
buy it in United States or Singapore or elsewhere. They don't have to buy it in India.
right, sir. So it would be, I mean, interesting to see that how that ban is implemented, because everything is on the internet. So
If-
I'm not really sure that how can that be regulated. Let's see.
I'm only tempted to get in here and caution that it's true that it should not be seen as a currency, it should be seen as an investment. And rightly said by Gaksab, why not it be seen as a P2P lending? But if you are investing only to look at the volatility part of it, then you have to be very cautious about it. I have, as a banker, tried to decipher and understand the volatility part of the pricing. I have not understood, although they say it is demand supply, but this is crazy, one. Secondly, unfortunately, the anonymity part in the whole system because of the DLT, I'm worried that it should not be misused. If it is being used for the right purposes, I think as an investment asset, things have to go forward. As rightly said by Gaksab, you can't talk of the conventional things in this era. You have to move ahead. And I think nothing wrong about it, but with all these cautions. Thank you.
Yes, sir. So without any further delay, we'll be moving to the Q&A. So we have a few questions from the participants. So I want first like Charan sir to give his views on what effect does the acceptance of working group recommendations by RBI mean for private banks? Should RBI allow business houses to open banks? How should we go forward?
Actually, this question is should be targeted to Mr. Garg.
I can prepare an answer based on my
because for decades they have been there, and he was on the RBI board for a long time. My short answer to this very longish issue in the RBI is that RBI is doing a very right approach. When the banks were nationalized, they were nationalized keeping in mind the nexus that can happen between a bank and the parent private house. And I'm trained as a conservative banker, or you can call me as a student of Mr. Tarapur, a conservative Parsi banker, right? So therefore, I think the RBI is right in making this clear division between the two. But because he's been the finance secretary, and he's the one who's been taking major decisions, I would also like to learn from him.
Yes, sir. Since Charan sir has asked, I think Subhash sir has to give some light on this.
See, I think the underlying sort of concern and the caution behind the reluctance to permit the industrial and large corporate houses in the banking is very well founded. You see, what the bank does is it lends to the industry. So if you're on both sides of the table, then there is a very clear likelihood of the conflict coming in. You see it even in cooperatives. Forget about industry. The cooperatives, they themselves own the cooperatives and they themselves lend to them. And the capture which takes place in cooperatives by the owners lending to themselves is what leads to lots of cooperative banks going down under. Same thing might happen on the banking side. So the caution is well understood. But let's also remember at the same time that banking today is not a very cozy, or as earlier Mohanji was saying, lazy banking where you can make money by accessing cheap deposits and lending at higher administered or otherwise rates. It has become very competitive. There's other sources of banking, and therefore those corporates, you need those guys who can assess the risk very well. My own assessment about the public sector is that the biggest weakness is their inability to assess the risk. All that discussions which you are having about the wrong guys being lent, etc., this risk assessment is best done by those whose money is at stake, not by those whose money is not at stake. Salary is being paid irrespective of whatever results of the banks are. And therefore, we should figure out a way to get the large corporate, non-industrial houses to come in. And that would perhaps be the right compromise. If you take last 15 years of history of India, the perception that there are 100 guys waiting outside to take banking licenses is untrue. We have been able to give only 4 licenses for Universal Bank in last 15 years. There is not much of a demand. When we put it on tap, hardly anybody came. So it's not you are not spoiled for choice by saying that keep this out, keep that out. Rather, you need to get that who is the best guy and allow him to take the licenses. So I think we should modify this particular provision, which is at the root, that not large industrial corporate houses, but large non-industrial corporate. HDFC today is a big corporate house. It's a nice bank, right? Kotak, for example, ICICI's, UTI, now Axis, they are also large corporate houses. We should create such large. And next thing which we'll also do is that this artificial controls which we have put on the voting powers of the promoters and the corporate houses, we'll have to think about. Then we'll have strong players coming in and in the banking. That's my take on this issue.
I like to supplement what he just said. Totally agree with everything that he said. I would simply like to say we probably would need more industrialists whose names start with T rather than whose names start with or have a company like K. Then the confidence may build.
I will just like to add as a banker.
Proper criteria means with the Reserve Bank, so you can screen out the case of the.
That's true.
I just wanted to add to what my colleague said, that why are we talking about more banks? We are only looking at that who can bring the capital for setting up the bank. Now, the issue is that if the kind of a capital which is coming from the industrial houses, we'll go back to the pre-nationalization era, UCO Bank, Birla Ji ki hai, Falani Bank, Falani ki hai. I think all that is not required. What you need is you need the banks, because those who can bring the capital and can boost the growth of the credit and the economy. Rightly said by Garg sir, none of the large cooperative banks, the scheduled cooperative banks who are entitled to ask for universal license are coming forward. I was instantly part of the Gandhi Committee report of 2015, where we tempted the banks, please convert yourself into a small finance bank or universal bank. But no, because everybody wants control. And that is what probably is at the back of the mind for not considering the industrial houses. And I think rightly so, You need the bank, but you need the bank who are working for a larger cause and not for the limited cause. Thank you.
Yes, in the interest of time, I think we'll close the Q&A, and thank you all for your valuable insights.
Sure.
So thank you, and the best wishes to the youngsters. You are all wealth of this country. Please take up all the discussions in the right stride and move forward. Thank you. And
Wow,
thanks to
dear
Garg Sahab, thanks to Charan Singh ji. It was a pleasure to be with you all.
Yes, sir. So we
Do
are
we
extremely
exit?
sorry to, sir, just a couple of more minutes, sir.
Okay.
We're extremely sorry to all those whose questions are not picked up due to shortage of time. So I would like to end this discussion by conveying my thanks to our prominent speaker, Subhash sir, Mohan sir, and Charan sir. We heartily thank you for sparing us your time. Especially Mohan sir, we know that it's really early morning back there in the US, and we really appreciate you taking the pain to grace us with your presence. So it's been a pleasure and honor to be a part of this discussion with you all. The discussions have been both informative and interesting, and has really made us realize that just how practical economics can be. Subhash sir perspectives on the disruptive cryptocurrency and its implication on the traditional banking, his opinions on the inflation trajectory of India and developments in the Western world were really insightful. Charan sir helped us understand the bigger picture of asset monetization, implication of Gati Shakti initiative, as well as introspect our own preparedness towards the $5 trillion economy. And Mohan sir helped us in understanding some of the fundamental responsibilities and difficulties in the banking business, as well as how hyper-personalization and human resource reskilling will play a significant role in the growth story of India. I would request Priyanshi to end the discussion.
Thank you again to each and every one of you. It's been an absolute delight to listen to each and every one of you, and we really wished that this could have been done offline. But we do hope to see you all in campus someday. We would also like to extend a warm thanks to our Dean, Dr. Varun Nagraj. Thank you for giving us your time and gracing us with your presence for today's event. We would like to specially mention and extend a vote of thanks to Patnaik sir. Thank you so much, sir, for being a strong pillar and guiding us throughout. We would like to now thank our faculty heads, Monica ma'am and Anirudh sir, for supporting us and guiding us whenever we needed them. We would also want to extend a warm thanks to our faculty, staff, and especially our economics faculty, Tulsi ma'am, Monica ma'am, Anirudh sir, Patnaik sir, Pallavi sir, and Preeta ma'am. Pallavi ma'am and Preeta ma'am. Thank you all for making our economics foundation strong and for explaining us economics in such a simple manner that we were able to make the most out of today's session. Thank you to our audience as well for taking such a deep interest in this discussion and making this event a learning experience for all of us. We would like to thank Prahlad sir and Shilpa ma'am for helping us with the logistics. Last but surely not the least, we would also like to extend our thanks to the IT department, especially Jayashree ma'am and Saurav sir, for making sure we have a smooth event. We also apologize if by any chance we have forgotten to mention anybody. Just know that your contribution was highly appreciated for making this event smooth and glitch-free. Thank you.